She crossed the dim corridor barefoot and went to the place her aunt had told her not to go. The chess room at Pembury Hall stood empty at this hour, lit only by a banked fire and the candle she had carried from her bedroom. The candle in her hand wavered in a faint draught from under a closed door at the far end of the corridor. She steadied it against her hip and felt the wax bead warm against her wrist. Beeswax. Lavender from a sachet folded into her wrapper. The cold, pressed tin smell of the chamber stick. 2 glasses of port sat on the small table beside the board, dark as garnets in the firelight. One was empty. The second had not been touched. The white pieces had been waiting on her side of the board for 3 nights, and Eleanor Marlowe had woken at 2 in the morning, convinced she could no longer wait for 3 more. She was reaching for the white queen when the man already seated in the leather chair across from her said, without raising his head from the position, "You are in the wrong place." Her hand stilled an inch above the piece. She had not seen him in the deep shadow of the chair. He was very tall. Even seated, his knees rose past the edge of the table, and he wore a dark green hunting coat he had not bothered to change before coming downstairs. The wool was creased at the elbow, as though he had been leaning on the board for some time. The fire showed her, in turning patches of light, a strong jaw and a small white scar through his left eyebrow, both half turned away from her, and the long, careful shape of a hand that had been resting one knuckle on the white king for, she would have wagered, 20 minutes. "Possibly," she said. The word came out rather quieter than she had meant it. She did not move her hand. "But this is the only place in the house at this hour where the White Queen still has options." He looked up. For a long second he did not speak. Eleanor was used to being looked at. Every woman in her family had inherited the same dark chestnut hair and the same grey eyes that her mother's portrait painters had once called river water. But this man looked at her the way a player examines an unanticipated move, as if she had appeared on a board he had already cleared. "You play," he said. "I do." "At 2 in the morning?" "At any hour." "Sit," he said, and gestured to the chair opposite his own. She sat. She did not adjust her shawl. She did not apologize for the bare feet visible at the hem of her wrapper. She set the White Queen back where it had been and studied the position he had built. The White King was cornered, with only a single pawn left to defend it, the kind of position a person composes for himself when he is trying to work out what to do about a problem in his life. Eleanor recognized that habit. She had watched her father do it for 15 years. "You have been here 3 days," he said. "You have not played anyone." "My aunt's guests do not consider it ladylike." "And yet you have come down at 2. "Because at 2, I do not need to consider it." That earned her the smallest twitch of his mouth. Not yet a smile. He was not a man who arrived at smiles quickly, but the suggestion that one might exist somewhere in his repertoire if a person were patient enough to find it. "Black or white?" he said. "You have white." "I am abandoning white. It bores me." "Then I will take it. White is more interesting." He inclined his head, slid 2 of his pieces back to their starting squares, and waited. She opened with a quiet move, a knight's pawn, 2 squares forward, as if settling into the game without intending to commit. He answered with a textbook reply. She mirrored. He developed. She castled early. He raised an eyebrow. "You are conservative." "I am not. I am waiting." "For what?" "For you to assume I am conservative." His mouth did the twitching thing again. He moved his bishop to a square that committed him to a position. She studied it for almost a minute, head tilted, one finger touching the gold signet on her left thumb, her mother's, set with a faint indigo stone she rarely wore in company. Then she took the bishop with a knight she had not yet developed. Her knight had been 7 moves from that square at the start of the game. He sat back. "I see." "I doubt that," she said pleasantly. "But you will." They played. He recovered. He was good, better than most men she had played, including the brigadier her father had once invited to dine for the express purpose of being beaten by Eleanor's grandmother. He was good in the manner of a man who had been excellent at chess for so long that he had stopped having to think about it. Which meant, Eleanor knew, that he had stopped seeing what he was doing. He was a player of position. She was a player of patience. 2 o'clock in the morning was a patient woman's hour. By 3:30, his king was in a corner of his own making. She did not announce mate. She moved her queen into the only square that closed the position, withdrew her hand, and sat very still. He looked at the board. He looked at her hand. He looked at the queen. "Who taught you?" he said quietly. "My grandmother, then my father, then nobody, because nobody else in my family would play me twice." He nodded slowly. He did not look uncomfortable. He looked the way a man looks when something he has been carrying alone for too long has just been set down for him by someone else. "What is your name?" he said. She thought about the answer for slightly longer than was necessary. The truth was a heavier thing to give than people understood. It carried obligations on the far side of it. She had not come to Pembury Hall to be Lady Eleanor Wexford. She had come to be Eleanor Marlowe, her mother's maiden name, her aunt's quietly preferred address, for 6 weeks of being nobody's daughter. She owed this stranger nothing. He had not even given her his name. "Marlowe," she said. "Eleanor Marlowe." "Aldermere," he said. "Maximilian Hawke." She did not gasp. She did not curtsy from her chair. She did, however, allow one eyebrow to rise. "Aldermere," she said. "I imagined you taller." The candle on the table guttered in a fresh draught from beneath the door, and threw a long, warm tongue of bright, wavering shadow across the polished wood. She felt the faint, cold press of the stone hearth on her bare ankle, where she had crossed it without thinking, the rough silk of her wrapper sash against her wrist, the dry, sharp smell of cooled smoke rising from the smaller of the 2 iron fire-dogs. He laughed. It was the first sound she had ever heard him make that sounded like a man, and not like a duke. It went through the room and came back warmer. He stood. He was, in fact, very nearly the tallest man she had ever met, and bowed to her with grave, slightly amused formality. "Miss Marlowe." "Your Grace." "It is 3:30. "It is." "You will be missed at breakfast." "I never am." He picked up the white queen from the board. He held it for a moment, weighing it as if uncertain whether to put it back. Then, deliberately, he set it down beside her empty port glass. "Keep it," he said, "until we play again." He left first. She sat in the chair where her aunt had told her not to sit, watched the candle burn down to a pool of wax, and turned the white queen slowly between her thumb and forefinger, as though it were a question she had not yet finished asking. The fire collapsed in on itself with a soft sigh of consumed wood. Somewhere beyond the closed shutters, a fox barked twice, sharp and close, and was answered farther off by a second one. Eleanor sat for some minutes longer in the silence of an empty house at 4 in the morning. The chess piece in her hand was warm. She had been holding it tightly enough to take its temperature from her own, and the smooth ivory surface had a small chip on the queen's crown, where, decades earlier, somebody had dropped her on a flagstone floor. She traced the chip with the pad of her thumb. It was nothing of consequence. It was only that, by the 3rd or 4th circuit of the chip, she had begun to understand that her hand was not perfectly steady. She rose. She straightened the chairs. She did not, by either word or motion, acknowledge the fact that she had crossed her aunt's house barefoot for the first time in 20 years, and had walked back to her bedroom along a corridor whose floorboards she now knew in cold detail every creak of. The white queen went into the pocket of her wrapper. The empty port glass went onto the sideboard for the morning footman. The candle, which had burned itself nearly to the chamber stick, she snuffed between her fingers, quickly, before she had time to mind the brief sting of it, and she went up the back staircase in the dark. The bedroom that had been given to her at Pembury was a low square room over the south garden, papered in green and cream stripe, with a four-poster bed in green wool hangings, and a window seat under a deep sash window that admitted, in spring, the first sound of the dawn chorus, a full hour before the front of the house would hear it. She did not undress. She put the White Queen on the night table beside her father's last letter, drew her wrapper closer about her, and sat on the window seat with her cold feet tucked under her until the first thrush began. She slept perhaps 2 hours. She missed breakfast. By the time she came down, at the indecent hour of 10:30, in a high-collared morning gown of dark bronze silk that her aunt had chosen for her in February and that she had never had a particular reason to put on, the breakfast room had emptied to one footman, 3 pots of cold coffee, and Lady Pembury, who was reading a letter with the calm attention of a woman who had already decided what she meant to do about its contents. The breakfast room at Pembury looked east over a long lawn that had been cut the day before, and the cut grass smell had drifted in through the half-open sash and mixed with the hot, bitter scent of 3 pots of forgotten coffee, the sweet brown crust of yesterday's bread under a linen cloth, and the faint, clean lemon of the polish the maid had used on the sideboard the night before. The footman, who had been at his post since 6 and had not yet been relieved, stood with his hands folded behind his back and his eyes fixed on a point exactly 2 feet above Lady Pembury's head, as footmen did when they were trying very hard to be furniture. A long bar of morning sun crossed the white tablecloth and turned the silver fish slice into a small, brilliant, very serious mirror. Galahad, on the hearthrug, snored once and corrected himself. Eleanor pulled out the chair opposite her aunt, the chair she always took, the chair that gave her the long view down the south lawn to the lake, and sat. The chair sighed under her in the small, leather creak way that very old country chairs sigh. She did not, by either word or gesture, register that she had spent the night in her wrapper on a window seat. She lifted the small silver cream jug, considered it, set it down again. The cream had separated into 2 layers, the colour of pearl above the colour of bone, and she had never in her life been able to bring herself to pour the bone-coloured part of cream onto her coffee. "Sit," her aunt said, without looking up. "Tell me at once whether you have done anything I will be required to disapprove of." "I played chess," Eleanor said. "With whom?" "Aldemir." Lady Pembury set the letter down. Lady Pembury was as plump and serene as a partridge, and approximately as easy to dislodge from her chair. She wore deep violet and amber today, and her pug, Galahad, lay at her feet with the dignified scorn of a creature who knew himself to be the last bastion of taste in the household. And he had set up a problem on the board. I solved it. You beat him. He resigned. Eleanor. At his suggestion. Eleanor. It was very civilized. Lady Pembury picked up her teacup, considered it, and did not drink from it. And he asked your name. He did. And you gave it to him. Marlowe. Her aunt sighed, a long, content, theatrical sigh, the sigh of a woman who had been hoping for precisely this complication, and would not have admitted as much for the world. You have been at Pembury Hall for 4 days, Lady Pembury said. I had hoped you would be at least a fortnight before you began causing me trouble. He will look for you. He will not. He will. He has a tenant relief bill to push through Parliament, Eleanor said. She had been keeping count of his correspondence at Pembury for 3 days, because the postbag came up the avenue at the same hour every morning, and she was a woman who noticed which seals were on which letters. He will be in London by the end of the week. Which is not quite the same thing as not looking for you. It is exactly the same thing. Said Lady Pembury, who, it should be observed, agreed with very little that other people said, particularly not when she was about to behave as though they had said something else entirely. The morning room had gone very quiet, in the manner of a room that has decided, collectively, to wait and see. The pug on the hearthrug raised his head an eighth of an inch, considered the air, and lowered it again. The footman, who had been refilling the cold coffee pots from a jug of fresh hot water in the sideboard, stopped pouring at the precise moment the jug had reached the proper level, and remained motionless with the jug still in his hand. Outside the open south sash, a robin in the wisteria, the same robin, Eleanor was reasonably sure, that had been in the same wisteria for 3 springs running, produced a single experimental note, considered the morning, and produced 3 more. There was a footstep in the doorway. Aldemir stood in it. He had bathed. He had changed. He wore a charcoal morning coat tailored close to his shoulders, and a pale waistcoat with thin silver stripes. And he did not, Eleanor noticed, look like a man who had spent much of the previous night working through a chess position with a stranger. He looked rested. "Lady Pembury," he said, and bowed. "Aldemir, you are late for breakfast." "I am not breakfasting." "Then you are early for luncheon." "I have come to take leave of you. I depart for London this afternoon." "Already?" Lady Pembury did not sound surprised. Lady Pembury never sounded surprised about anything she had hoped would happen. "Miss Marlowe, my dear, allow me to introduce, although it would seem the introduction has in some informal sense already occurred, His Grace the Duke of Aldemir. Aldemir, my niece, Miss Eleanor Marlowe, who has come to me from the country and is keeping me from being unbearably bored this spring." "Miss Marlowe." Aldemir bowed. He did not, Eleanor saw, betray by so much as a flicker that he had taken her measure across a chessboard at 3 in the morning. "We have not been formally introduced. I am pleased to be so now." "Your Grace?" He held her eyes 1 beat longer than the courtesy required. Then he turned to her aunt. "I have a small request," he said. "It involves a tenant matter on the southern boundary I share with the Pembury estate. I had hoped to settle it before I left. I wonder, Lady Pembury, whether you might lend me your niece for half an hour. She came across the boundary lane yesterday on her morning walk. She will know the spot." Lady Pembury allowed her teacup the slightest of tremors. "You are inviting Eleanor to walk to a hedge with you, Aldemir." "I am inviting her to walk to a stile." "The distinction is felt." "I appreciate it." "And what shall I be doing while you and my niece settle hedges and stiles?" "You shall be writing," said Aldemir gravely, "the most withering possible letter to your steward about this morning's coffee." Eleanor's mouth did something it did not often do. It almost smiled. "Very well," her aunt said. "Galahad shall accompany you, however. He is the soul of propriety. Eleanor, the bronze cloak, please, not the grey. The grey makes you look too sensible to argue with." So Eleanor went to walk to a stile with the Duke of Aldemir. The hawthorn had begun to flower along the boundary lane. White blossom rose on either side of the path, until the air was that specific spring sweetness that always made Eleanor, who did not believe in superstition, superstitious. Galahad waddled ahead of them, with the fixed determination of a creature who has been told he is propriety and intends to take the assignment seriously. "You are very quiet, Miss Marlowe." "You are taking me to a stile, Your Grace. I am conserving conversation for the dramatic moment of arrival." "There is no dramatic moment." "There is always a dramatic moment. Drama lives in stiles. I am sure you have noticed." He glanced at her. The small white scar through his eyebrow caught the light. "Why am I really walking with you?" she said. He did not pretend not to understand. "Last night," he said, "you closed a position I'd been trying to close for 9 days. It was a chess problem." It was not. She kept her eyes on the path. Galahad had stopped to investigate a clump of cowslips with the focus of a man assessing a parliamentary bill. "You composed a real problem onto a board," she said quietly. "You wanted to see whether the shape of it, taken out of words, was solvable." "Yes." "And I solved the shape." "You did." "Then you would like me to solve the original?" if you can. She let 3 steps pass before she answered. The blossom shifted overhead. Somewhere behind a hedge, a thrush was carrying on a long argument with itself. The warm dust smell of the cart track, baked dry by yesterday's sun. The bright, sharp green of the new hawthorn leaves, wet from a small dawn rain. The cold, faint silver of the lake at the foot of the south meadow, visible in long, thin glints between the trunks of the oak walk. Eleanor catalogued each in passing, the way her father had taught her to catalogue items on a docket, marking them, filing them, before allowing herself to speak. "Tell me the original." He told her. He told her precisely, with the economy of a man accustomed to summarizing complicated matters for his father's solicitors. There was a stretch of moorland on his southern boundary that 3 families of his tenants had grazed, by long custom, without legal title. His late father had begun the slow process of formalizing their right. The process had been interrupted by his father's illness, and by the Duke himself becoming the Duke at 23, in the middle of a winter, with the entire estate machinery to learn at once. A neighbouring landowner named Whitford had since claimed the moorland under an old enclosure grant of doubtful provenance, and was preparing to fence it before the summer. Aldermere's solicitors had advised that the matter could be contested at law. Aldermere was inclined to contest it at law. The difficulty was that the case would take 3 years, would expose Whitford's hand publicly, and would mean 3 winters during which the tenants who had grazed the moor, 3 families, 11 children among them, 2 of whom kept Aldermere's own home dairy, would have to abandon their flocks and move away. He stopped speaking when they reached the stile. Eleanor put her gloved hand on the wood and looked over it. Beyond, the moorland rolled away pale gold under late April light. Sheep moved on it. A boy in a too large cap ran along a low wall, chased by a brown and white dog who appeared to be losing on purpose. "There is a faster route than the courts," she said. "Is there?" "There is. It is older and considerably more humiliating to Lord Whitford. It does not require litigation. It requires 3 signatures." "Whose?" "His." "Whose what?" "His 3 signatures." She turned to face him. "On 3 separate instruments, each acknowledging the customary right under common law of grazing in perpetuity. Your father did not need to enclose. Your father needed to record. The records are missing because they were never made. Make them now. Have your steward draw the deeds. Take them to Whitford in the company of your bishop, your member of parliament, and the magistrate, all 3 of whom owe your house a courtesy by long custom, none of which Whitford can refuse without humiliation. Tell Whitford the deeds are merely formal acknowledgement of what every man in the county knows is already true. Invite him to sign. He will sign. He will sign because the alternative is being seen to refuse 3 pieces of paper in front of the bishop, the member, and the magistrate. And once he has signed, the 3 years of litigation become 3 minutes of ink." Aldermere did not answer for the longest time she had ever stood beside a stile, in silence, with a man she had met at 3 in the morning. "Where," he said finally, "did you learn that?" "I read." "You read what?" "Land law, common rights case histories, boundary disputes." "Why?" She did not answer that. She lifted Galahad over the stile, which he tolerated with an expression of forgiving martyrdom. "You have not asked," Aldermere said carefully, "the more relevant question. The question of why Whitford is doing this." "I have not asked it because I already know the answer." He turned his head sharply toward her. "He wants something of you," she said. "Probably your support of his cousin's promotion to the bishop's bench. Probably his cousin's promotion to anything on which a duke's signature carries weight. The moor is leverage. He is not interested in the moor. He is interested in the price you will pay to keep your tenants where they are. Sign the deeds, take the leverage off the table, and his hand collapses. He will retreat to drawing rooms and complain that you are unsubtle. Let him. How can you possibly know any of this?" "I read," she said again. He looked at her for a very long moment. The white blossom shifted between them. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "what is your father?" She thought about the answer for the second time in 12 hours. The honest answer would change the shape of this conversation completely. She would no longer be the countrywoman who had wandered up from breakfast to walk to a stile and solve his political problem. She would be the daughter of a marquis, the third great political family of the South, the woman who had been raised in her father's library and trained at her father's elbow to draft 3 out of every 5 letters that left her father's desk. She would become explicable. He would file her away. She did not want to be filed away. Not yet. "My father," she said, "is a careful man who taught me to read the law before he taught me to dance." That is not an answer. It is the answer for today. He did not press. Galahad, who had finally completed a satisfactory tour of the cowslip clump on the far side of the stile, returned to them with the visible patience of a chaperone whose patience has limits. The boy on the moor had stopped running and stood watching them, his too large cap pushed back on a head of brown curls. He raised his hand in a bright, unself-conscious wave. Aldemir lifted his hand in return. "That," he said quietly, "is Charlie. His father is my head gardener. He brings me apples." Apples? From the South Orchard, every Wednesday, without invitation, without fail. He believes himself to be the senior horticultural authority of the estate. I have never had the courage to disabuse him. For the first time since she had walked into his chess room the night before, Eleanor allowed herself to smile at him properly. It was a small smile. It was given quickly and taken back, but it was given. "Your Grace," she said, "you are softer than your reputation." "I am the same hardness as my reputation," he said. "I am only also other things at the same time." They walked back to the house. He did not, this time, ask any more questions. She did not, this time, refuse any. They simply walked beside one another in the spring-warm hawthorn light, with Galahad puffing ahead of them, and at the front steps of Pembury Hall, he bowed over her hand and said, "I will write to you when I have spoken to Whitford." "To my aunt's house, as Miss Marlowe?" "As Miss Marlowe, yes." Then he was gone. She watched the carriage roll down the avenue until the trees took it. She did not cry. She did not sigh. She stood very still on the gravel in her dark bronze cloak, and felt, in the specific cold pit at the bottom of her ribs that she had been carrying for 16 weeks since the breaking of her engagement, the first faint and frightening warmth of something coming back to life. The gravel beneath her boots was the pale yellow gravel of all Pembury approaches, raked twice a week by a man named Hobbs, who held the work as a matter of personal pride. A faint, small wind, colder than the air, came up from the lake at the foot of the South Meadow, and carried with it the smell of wet stone and last year's reed beds. Somewhere overhead, a wood pigeon launched itself out of an oak with a slow, heavy clap of wings. Somewhere closer, a thrush worked at a snail on the wall. The cherry trees in the bordering walks had not yet quite committed to blossom, but their dark, wet branches were studded with the small, tight pink fists of buds that would be open by the weekend. Eleanor, who had been raised to believe that gentlewomen did not stand still on gravel without an occupation, stood without an occupation on the Pembury gravel for a full count of 40 before she heard her aunt's voice from somewhere behind her left shoulder say, mildly, "Come in, my dear. Galahad has missed you." Then she turned, lifted Galahad onto her hip, and went inside to read a letter from her father that had arrived the night before, and that she had not yet had the courage to open. The letter read, in part, "Whitford has been to me twice this week. The peerage he wants for his cousin will be arranged through me, or it will not be arranged. He has offered, in exchange, the support of his northern bloc on the tenant relief bill. I have not yet answered him. I will not answer him without your counsel. The bill matters, my dear. The peerage is squalid. Tell me how to thread it." Eleanor sat down by the window of her aunt's morning room with the letter in her lap and the White Queen, which she had carried up from breakfast in her pocket, on the windowsill beside her hand. She did not, after all, write to her father that day. She wrote to him on the third day, when Aldermere's first letter to her arrived from London, short, formal, and addressed to Miss Marlowe at Pembury, informing her that the deeds were drawn, the bishop had agreed to come down, and Whitford had signed all 3 instruments inside half an hour, and that the moorland would be in trust for the 3 families before the end of the month. The postscript read, "I find I am writing to you. I do not know whether you will permit me to continue." Eleanor sat with that letter in her lap for an hour. The morning room at Pembury faced east. The light at this hour was the kind of pale, washed, slightly green spring light that in another season she would have called comforting. The window stood half open to a draught of garden air that smelled of the cold black earth of newly turned beds, of bruised mint from the kitchen plot under the south wall, and of the first breath of warming stone from the south terrace. A bee had got in, lazy with the hour and stupid with the unaccustomed warmth, and was making its slow, patient way along the inside of the upper sash. Eleanor watched the bee. She did not move to free it. She watched it because, while she watched it, she did not have to look at the second of Aldermere's 2 letters, the polite one, the deeded business letter, and decide what she was going to write back. She had not written him a personal letter in her life. She had drafted 100 letters for her father, 2 for her grandmother, 4 for her aunt, and roughly 30 for the various solicitors of the Wexford estate. She had never written a letter that was simply hers, addressed to a man simply his, with no third-party purpose to wrap around the truth of what she meant to say. The blank piece of paper on the writing table in front of her was, she realized with mild astonishment, the most intimidating piece of paper she had ever sat down in front of. She rose. She paced once around the room. She returned to the desk. She picked up the pen. She put it down. She picked it up again. She considered briefly opening with a description of the Cherry Walk. She discarded the Cherry Walk because it was a coward's opening. She considered opening with a question about the bishop. She discarded the question because it was a politician's opening, and she was not, this morning, a politician. She considered opening with a sentence about chess. She wrote that sentence. She crossed it out. She wrote it again. She stared at it for some minutes. Then she crossed it out a second time and began over with the simplest opening she had yet considered, which was 3 words. Your Grace. Then she wrote 1 letter to her father, the contents of which her father read twice with growing thoughtfulness, and 1 letter to Aldermere, the contents of which she did not preserve, and which Aldermere kept folded in his pocketbook for the rest of his natural life. Both letters left Pembury Hall by the same afternoon post. Spring deepened. In the 3 weeks that followed, alongside the small handful of signed letters that passed openly between Pembury and Aldermere House, Eleanor began another correspondence. It was not addressed to Aldermere. It was not signed at all. Once or twice a week, she folded a single sheet of unmarked paper, a page of names, a page of voting tallies, the precise wording of an amendment Whitford's people meant to propose in committee, the names of 2 northern members who could be brought across with a courtesy, and a third who could not, sealed it with a plain wafer, and sent it down to a London receiving house her aunt's approachable solicitor used for unsigned matter. From the receiving house it went, by the next morning's post, to the desk of the Duke of Aldermere. She did not write to him about the notes. He did not, in his signed letters, mention them. They both, in the careful manner of 2 players who had agreed on an opening without having spoken of it, allowed the second correspondence to run beneath the first, like a quiet river under a bridge. The hawthorn on the boundary lane bloomed and began to give up its blossom to the wind. The cherry in Lady Pembury's south garden turned the gravel walks pink. Lady Pembury, who had a country house party planned for the 2nd week of May, had, for reasons she would not explain, extended invitations she had not previously intended to extend. 1 had gone to Aldermere. He had accepted. A second had gone to Lord Whitford. He too had accepted. "Aunt," Eleanor said when she found out, "what have you done?" "I have engineered a small situation," Lady Pembury said placidly, working a length of amber silk through her embroidery hoop. "It will resolve itself. These things do." "You have invited the man who is publicly ruining Aldermere's bill to sit at the same table as Aldermere." "I have invited 2 of the 3 most boring conversational partners in Hampshire, my dear, and one rather interesting one. The other guests will be relieved." "Aunt." "Eleanor." "He will recognize Aldermere's pattern. He will recognize mine." "Then perhaps," said Lady Pembury, "it is time someone did." So the house party began. It began, as Lady Pembury's house parties always began, in the long yellow drawing room, with a great deal of furniture rearranged into convivial circles, an excess of cake, and Galahad presiding over the hearthrug like a furry magistrate. Eleanor, in a high-waisted gown of soft pearl-grey muslin with an indigo sash, came down at the proper hour, and was in the act of accepting a cup of tea from a footman when she realized that Aldermere was already in the room. He was at the south window. He turned the moment she crossed the threshold. There was no missing the moment in which he saw her, because his expression, which had been polite and slightly bored, the expression of a man enduring a country house party for political reasons, went still. "Miss Marlowe," he said, crossing the room to her. He bowed. "Your Grace. It has been 3 weeks." "It has. You did not write again." "I did. You did not receive it. I sent it to Aldermere House by hand the day before yesterday. It will be on your desk in London by tomorrow." "What did it say?" The warm, sweet wax and candle smell of the long yellow drawing room pressed close around them. Behind her shoulder, the bright fire was throwing soft tongues of warm light across the polished oak floor. She felt the cold, smooth porcelain of the teacup against the pad of her thumb, and the rough silk of the indigo sash at her waist where her wrist had pressed it. "That Whitford has approached my aunt's solicitor, with a fresh proposal, through a back door. It is the same proposal as before, in different wrapping." "Through your aunt's solicitor?" "My aunt has many solicitors. One is paid to be approachable. He sends me everything." He looked at her. The small white scar through his eyebrow caught the late afternoon light. "You are doing my political accounting for me, Miss Marlowe." "I am doing my own. It has incidental application to yours." He almost smiled. "I should be insulted." "You should not. You should be relieved that whatever I am doing for myself, I am willing to share the working of with you. For now." "For now." A movement at the door. Only the small, soft sound of a footman stepping aside, but distinct in a room that had gone subtly quieter at the front hall side. Lord Whitford had entered the drawing room. He was, as expected, beautiful. Aldermere had told her once, in a London letter, that Whitford was the most handsome man in the upper House of Lords. It was meant as warning. He was very fair, very tall, very pale of eye, dressed in a dove-grey morning coat and ivory waistcoat that turned the spring light around him into a kind of halo. Eleanor had never met him. She had been, when she might have done, in mourning for her grandmother. She had been, more recently, broken off from the engagement that had nearly become her life and had not been receiving callers. He saw Aldermere first. He saw Aldermere with a small, polite, perfectly executed smile that did not reach his pale eyes. Then he saw Eleanor. And his face did something interesting. It did nothing. Which was, Eleanor knew at once, the most informative possible reaction. A man who registered a stranger felt one of 3 things: interest, indifference, or the specific blank of a man who was determined not to be seen registering. Whitford had chosen the third, which meant that Whitford had recognized her face. She had not been formally presented, but there had been a portrait in her father's London townhouse, done when she was 19, 3 months before her grandmother's funeral, that hung in the gallery off the drawing room where her father received political callers. Whitford had been in that drawing room twice this season alone. He inclined his head to her, politely, distantly, as to a stranger. "Lady Pembury," he said, advancing into the room with his perfect smile. "What a charming gathering. And Aldemir, I was not expecting to see you." "Whitford. I imagined you in town, working on your bill." "The bill is in committee." Of course. Whitford turned to Lady Pembury. "Dear lady, present me." So Lady Pembury, who Eleanor reflected was enjoying this evening more than was perhaps strictly Christian, presented Lord Whitford to Miss Eleanor Marlowe, niece of the house. Whitford bowed over Eleanor's hand. He held it 1/2 second longer than the courtesy required. He smiled at her. The smile was a beautiful smile, and meant absolutely nothing. "Miss Marlowe." "Lord Whitford." "I find your face strangely familiar." "You will be thinking of my mother. I am told I resemble her." She said it pleasantly, as if she were discussing weather. "She was a Wexford. She was much in town when she was young." It was not quite a lie. It was not quite the truth. It was the smallest possible amount of information that could be exchanged in a drawing room without provoking a duel. Whitford's eyes went, just for one fraction of a heartbeat, to Aldemir, then back to Eleanor. The polite smile reset. "A Wexford," he murmured. "Of course. That accounts for it." Then Lady Pembury, who had been watching this exchange with the bright, detached interest of a naturalist observing something in a jar, said brightly, "And now we shall have music. Eleanor, would you do me the great kindness of playing? Aldemir, you will turn the pages." So Eleanor played. Aldemir turned the pages. Whitford watched. And the country house party, which had 3 days and 4 nights still to run, began. It was on the second evening, in the chess room, that the line was set. The 2 days between the arrival of the company and the moment of the line passed in the way most country house party days passed at Pembury Hall. Early breakfast for those who chose it, longer breakfast for those who did not. Walks in the south garden among the cherry blossom that had now opened into a haze of pink so thick it muffled sound. Archery on the lawn for those who had been raised to it. An embarrassed, informal music after tea for the young ones. The long-preserved ritual of dinner, and the long dispersing of the dinner guests into smaller rooms afterward, for cards, billiards, music, and chess. Eleanor took a great deal of trouble, across both days, to be in rooms Whitford was not in. She walked early. She rode at midday. She sat out the music for the curate's sake, and read aloud to her aunt in the small library after tea. She did not speak to Aldemir alone. He, by an instinct she watched develop in him hour by hour, did not speak to her alone either. They were waiting for the same thing without having said so. Both of them were trained, by years of correspondence and politics respectively, to be patient with the construction of a final scene. The cherry walk along the south wall of Pembury Hall, on the second afternoon of the company's stay, was at the precise, short-lived peak that every gardener who has ever worked a south wall waits for. The blossom was pink, the colour of the inside of a shell, banked thick on either side of the path, and its weight had pressed the small, low boughs inward across the path, until a person walking beneath them moved through a pale, soft tunnel of slow-falling petals. Eleanor walked the cherry walk twice that afternoon, once before luncheon with her aunt, and once after with the curate, who was a young man of unremarkable features and considerable kindness, who had been pressed into propriety duty for the duration of the party. And on both occasions, Whitford was at one end or the other of the walk, leaning on the stone balustrade above the rose terrace, watching the path with the unhurried patience of a man who was prepared to wait. The petals settled in Eleanor's hair. She left them there. The curate, who had been raised in a country parsonage and who had never in his life walked a cherry walk with a woman who had petals in her hair, was reduced to an entirely admirable silence. Whitford, for his part, watched her. He watched her in the breakfast room with the precise, polite, slightly puzzled attention of a man trying to fit a face into a memory. He watched her in the corridor outside the library with the same attention. He watched her at dinner the second evening with the attention of a man who had nearly placed the face, and was waiting for the moment when the placement would be useful. A letter arrived for Eleanor on the Tuesday afternoon, short, written in her father's hand, marked private, which she read once, stopped at the second sentence, and folded back into its cover before any other person in the house had observed her receive it. Was it possible, the letter asked, that Whitford had already begun to suspect? Her father had heard a whisper from a London club. He counselled patience. He laughed, in the postscript, at himself for counselling patience to a daughter who had taught him the discipline. Eleanor had been watched by sharper eyes than Whitford's all her life, and she did not, by any expression of her own, give him the help she could see he was waiting for. She let him watch. She let him assemble the resemblance to her mother's portrait, the dark chestnut hair, the river-water grey of the eyes, the gold signet on the left thumb that ought not to have belonged to a country girl named Marlowe. And she watched him assemble those details with the calm certainty that he would not, in the end, do anything sensible with them. Whitford was a man who used recognition as a weapon. He would, when he had finished placing her, deploy the recognition. He would not, before that, simply ask. The chess room at Pembury Hall, by daylight, was not the room she had played him in at 3 a.m. It was a long, bright space, with 2 windows opening onto the Cherry Walk, 4 leather chairs arranged in pairs, 2 boards always set up, and the perpetual smell of beeswax and of the cedar of the cabinet in which the older sets were kept. After dinner the room had filled, as such rooms do. Old Mr. Hartwell, who was 3 glasses past his limit, was attempting to defeat the curate at an opening Mr. Hartwell did not understand. 2 of Lady Pembury's young cousins were playing a noisy and incompetent game by the window. Whitford was sitting in the deeper of the 2 leather chairs by the fire, playing nothing, watching everything. The fire had been built up to a brisk evening burn against an unseasonable cold that had settled with the dark, and the candles in their sconces along the long inner wall gave the whole room a soft, underwater wavering of light. Galahad, who, as a senior member of the household, considered himself entitled to evening privileges, had taken up his position on the hearthrug between Whitford's boots and the fire, and was dozing with the particular vigilance of a pug who knew himself to be the only entity in the room with any moral authority. Aldemir had set up a problem at the far board. He had not invited Eleanor to join him. She had drifted to the board on her own, in a high-collared evening gown of deep emerald silk that her aunt had insisted upon, and was studying the position over his shoulder when he glanced up at her. "You see it?" he said, low. "Of course." "How?" "Mate in 3. Bishop sacrifice. The white king goes left, not right. The queen does not chase. Take with the bishop. Force him to take with the rook. Knight to f6. And the position is closed." She said it quietly. She thought she had said it quietly enough. She had not. Across the room, Whitford set down his glass with a small, precise click. "My word, Aldemir," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The drawing room of Pembury Hall, like most drawing rooms in May, was bored, and bored rooms hear everything. Has it really come to this? A grown man cannot solve a chess problem in a country house drawing room without applying to the lady he is, what was the phrase, turning pages for. There was a small, uncomfortable laugh from Mr. Hartwell, who did not know any better. The curate, who did know better, found something interesting in his sleeve. Lady Pembury, on the chaise, did not move at all. Aldemir's jaw tightened. "Miss Marlowe is a strong player," he said. His voice was carefully level. "Of course she is. Country guards have so much time on their hands. It is charming." Whitford stood up. He crossed the room with the unhurried elegance of a man who has long understood that elegance is a weapon. He paused at the board. He looked down at the position. Then he looked at Eleanor, smiled his perfect smile, and said, in that low voice that carried, "But really, my dear young lady, there is such a thing as forgetting one's place. A drawing-room is not a parliament. A duke is not a tutor. You should have known your place." The room did not breathe. Eleanor felt, with the unhurried clarity that always came to her in crisis, the precise shape of every person in the room. Lady Pembury, motionless. The curate, gone the colour of his collar. Mr. Hartwell, beginning to understand, beginning to be appalled. Aldemir, whose hands had gone still on the board, beginning to rise. She put her hand, very lightly, on Aldemir's shoulder. He stilled. She turned to Whitford. She did not raise her voice. She did not, in fact, raise anything. She simply looked at him, as one looks at a piece on a board one has played many times before. "Lord Whitford," she said, "you are mistaken about my place, but I forgive you the mistake. You will have many opportunities to correct it." She lifted her hand from Aldemir's shoulder. She inclined her head to the room as a whole, a polite, perfectly composed inclination, and she walked out of the chess room of Pembury Hall. She walked, in fact, all the way upstairs. The corridor between the chess room and the back staircase at Pembury was a long one, panelled in the dark oak that had been the proper material for country corridors in the year 1740, and had been the slightly old-fashioned material for country corridors ever since, hung with the small, dim portraits of various Pemburys, whom Lady Pembury referred to collectively as the disappointments. Eleanor walked the corridor at the unhurried pace she had been walking at when she had left the chess room, neither slower nor faster, the dark emerald silk of her gown a single sliding gleam in the candle-lit dim. She did not pass anyone. The household, with the particular intelligence household staffs reserved for the moment immediately after a public scene, had withdrawn itself into the back passages and the kitchen stair, and the front of the house was, for the duration of her ascent, a private corridor for one woman to use in any way she pleased. She used it for walking. She walked to her bedroom. She closed the door. She rang for her maid. She told her maid, quietly, to pack everything by morning and to tell the coachman they would be leaving at dawn. Then she sat down at the small writing desk by the window and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father, 3 lines long. It read, "The matter is decided. I will be in London on Tuesday. Have the gallery curtains opened in the front drawing room. E." The second was to Aldemir, 1 line long. It read, "I did not need defending. I needed believing. I am not, as it happens, in the wrong place." She did not weep. Eleanor Marlowe, who had been Lady Eleanor Wexford for 25 years and Eleanor Marlowe for 6 weeks, sat at the writing desk in her aunt's house with the White Queen on the desk beside her hand and felt the cold pit at the bottom of her ribs reopen slightly, and did not weep. Then she went to bed. She left at dawn. The dawn at Pembury Hall in the 2nd week of May was a long, unhurried affair of bird noise and pale grey-green light along the eastern hedges. The thrushes had begun before 3. The blackbirds had joined them at 4:30. By the time Eleanor came down the stairs in her travelling dress, pale grey worsted, a darker grey wool cloak across one arm, the sort of clothes a woman wore when she had decided to be invisible inside a moving vehicle for 9 hours, the rooks in the southern elms had assembled themselves into one of those long, contented arguments rooks have at sunrise, audible all the way through the closed front doors. The front hall of Pembury was lit by a single oil lamp that the night footman had not yet snuffed. The marble floor, which by daylight was a warm cream checkered with dove grey, looked at this hour the colour of cold milk. The travelling cases stood in 2 neat columns by the double doors. Eleanor's maid had been weeping silently for the last 20 minutes. Her eyes were pink, and her mouth was set in the determined line of a woman who refused, on principle, to allow her mistress to see her cry. Eleanor had pretended not to notice. The kindest thing she could do this morning, for everyone, was to pretend not to notice. Lady Pembury, who had risen at the indecent hour of 4:30 in order to be in the front hall when her niece descended the stairs, embraced her once, briefly, and said, "Eleanor, Aunt, I will not apologize for inviting him. I will, however, apologize for misjudging him. I had thought he would be merely tedious." He was merely tedious. The other one made the mistake. You allowed Aldemir to make the mistake. You allowed him to see Whitford humiliate you and not contradict it on the spot. I gave him the opportunity to contradict it. He was preparing to. I removed the opportunity from him. Why? Because if he had risen and contradicted Whitford, he would have done it for the woman he had decided to call Miss Marlowe. He would not have done it for Lady Eleanor Wexford. He would have done it for the wrong woman. I do not require to be defended by a man who does not yet know which woman he is defending. Lady Pembury looked at her niece for a long moment. You are going to break his heart by Wednesday, she said. I am going to give him the opportunity to find it. He may then bring it to me on Friday, and we will see whether it is the right shape. Eleanor, Aunt, tell your father I shall come up to London for the Wexford ball. There is no Wexford ball. There will be, said Lady Pembury complacently, and helped her niece into the carriage. The carriage rolled out of the avenue at the precise moment the sun cleared the eastern hedges, and the long shadow of the carriage was thrown ahead of it across the wet gravel for the first half-mile, in the manner of a polite footman who had walked on ahead with a lamp. The road from Pembury to London was a road Eleanor had travelled in every season since the year she was 8, and she watched the familiar landmarks slide past the carriage window at the pace of a person reading a book she had read before. The milestones, the ford at Marlowe's farm, the single oak with the lightning-split crown, the Roman milestone that everyone agreed was not Roman. Eleanor reached London by Tuesday afternoon. The Wexford townhouse in Grosvenor Square stood as it had always stood. Pale stone, glossy black door, brass knocker shaped like a fox. The footman who opened the door took her travelling cloak without expression and said, "His lordship is in the library, my lady." She was Lady Eleanor Wexford again the moment she crossed the threshold. Her father, the Marquis of Wexford, rose from his desk when she came in. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with grey at his temples and the same river-water eyes as his daughter, and he kissed her forehead the way he had kissed her forehead the day her mother had been buried 16 years earlier, as though every kiss were the same kiss, freshly given. Eleanor. Father, you sent the 3-line letter. I did. That is the letter you have been writing in your head for 16 weeks. It is. He sat down. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. She took it, smoothed her travelling skirt, and did not, even for a moment, allow her hands to tremble. The library at Wexford House faced south over the small enclosed garden behind the townhouse, and the May light at this hour came through the tall sash windows and lay across the desk in 2 long rectangles divided by the Muntin shadow. The desk was the desk her grandfather had bought in Paris in 1789, a great calm surface of inlaid satinwood and ebony, the size of a small altar, and very nearly as serious. On its near edge stood the silver inkstand her father had been given by the Wexford block on the carrying of his first major bill in 1812. On its far edge, the small green leather blotter where he composed the letters he meant to be remembered for. Between them, today, sat the morning's correspondence in 3 neat piles: personal, estate, political. Eleanor's eye, trained over 15 years at this desk, found the seal of Whitford's solicitor on the second letter of the political pile within 4 seconds of sitting down. The room smelled, as it always smelled, of beeswax, and of the faint, dry tang of the very old leather bookbindings on the wall behind the desk, and, under both of those, almost imperceptibly, the way a smell long associated with a person becomes the smell of the person, of the plain, unscented soap her father had used since her mother's death. 16 weeks she had been away from this room. The room had taken her absence the way old rooms take any absence, by pretending, unconvincingly, not to have noticed. "Tell me," he said, "what we are doing about Whitford." "We are not, as it happens, doing anything about Whitford. Whitford is going to do something about himself. He will find out tomorrow that the Wexford block will not, on any condition, support his cousin's promotion to the bishop's bench. He will find out the day after that the Wexford block will, in unanimity, support Aldermere's tenant relief bill. He will find out the day after that I am giving a ball. You have not given a ball in 4 years. I am giving one now, to which Aldemir will be invited. To which Aldemir will be invited. With instructions to decline? With no instructions whatsoever. Her father studied her for a long time. You have decided, he said. I have decided to give him the opportunity to decide. I will not decide for him. And if he does not come, then I will know, and we will not refer to it again. And if he comes and says the wrong thing, then I will know, and we will not refer to it again. And if he comes and says the right thing. A coal in the iron grate behind her father's chair shifted with a quiet, bright crack, and threw a brief shower of fire sparks up the cold, black throat of the chimney. The smell of coal smoke, the dry leather of the desk blotter under her father's hand, the faint silver tang of the inkwell. Eleanor's eyes did not leave his face. Then we will refer to it for a long time. The Marquis of Wexford, who had once stood for 2 hours in a rain-darkened cemetery beside the small brown coffin of his wife, and had not allowed himself to weep until he reached the carriage, allowed himself to smile. Very well, he said. Have Hardwick send out the cards. The Wexford ball was set for Friday evening. The cards, when they went out, did not say ball. They said, an evening of music and conversation at the house of the Marquis of Wexford, in honour of his daughter, the Lady Eleanor, lately returned from the country. They were the sparest possible cards. They were, therefore, the most thoroughly read cards in London that week. The London of the Wexford household, the London of Grosvenor Square and the long upstairs gallery, and the green silk drawing rooms over the front portico, was a different London from the one Eleanor had lived in 3 months earlier. In February, she had moved through these rooms in the hush of a household, carefully not naming the broken engagement. Her father had ceased holding political dinners. Her mother's portrait had been turned, by a quiet instruction she had not been asked to give, to face the wall. By the time the cards went out for the evening of music and conversation, the portrait had been turned back. The dust covers had come off the great chandelier in the gallery. 2 pianos had been tuned. The footman had been issued new white gloves. The household, which had been in the long-withheld breath of a house that had not been certain how to behave, had exhaled in one great organized exhalation, and was now, room by candlelit room, rehearsing the choreography of a return. Eleanor stood in the middle of the great gallery on Thursday evening, the night before the ball, in her plain travelling gown with her hair pinned back, and watched 2 footmen carry the long drawing-room rug, rolled like a wounded soldier, across the polished oak floor. Hardwick the butler, beside her, held a list. They went, item by item, through the choreography of the next evening. Where the orchestra, where the supper, where the candles, where the late footman, where the old Lady Wexford's silver. Hardwick had been butler at Wexford House for 31 years. He did not need the list. He held it because Eleanor had drafted it, and because Hardwick, who had known Eleanor since she was 5, understood that a woman who has been away from her own home for 16 weeks may need to hold the list of her returning, even if she does not need to consult it. And the gallery curtains, she said. Open. Open, my lady. All the way. All the way. And the portrait. Restored to its position above the gallery hearth at noon today, my lady. May I add, your ladyship's grandmother would have approved. My grandmother would have selected a different gown. The cold, smooth marble of the gallery floor beneath her thin slippers, the warm wax and rose smell of 200 candles being readied in their silver sconces along the long inner wall, the bright, hard glitter of the chandelier's cut crystal as the second housemaid drew the dust cloth off. These were the small touches Eleanor had been waiting to feel for 16 weeks. Her hand on the brass stair rail was steady. Her breath was even. Her pulse, against the ruby at her throat, was quiet. Your grandmother, my lady, would have selected the dark ruby silk you have already chosen. Eleanor looked at Hardwick. Hardwick, who in 31 years had committed exactly 7 smiles to the service of the Wexford household, did not smile now. He did, however, allow the corner of his very dignified mouth to lift 1/16 of an inch, and Eleanor, who had known him since she was 5, accepted the lift as the salute it was. She slept 4 hours that night. She woke before her maid did. She went down at 5:30 to the gallery in her wrapper and stood for a long time beneath her own portrait in the cold, pale grey of a London May dawn, until the household began to stir below her, and Hardwick, who had also risen before dawn for the same purpose, climbed the gallery stairs with 2 cups of strong black coffee on a silver tray, and stood beside her without remark while she finished considering what kind of woman she was prepared, this evening, to be. Aldermere received his on Wednesday morning, at his desk in the library at Aldermere House. The library at Aldermere House was, by the standards of its kind, a quiet room. The shelves had been laid out by his grandfather, according to a Linnaean system the Duke had, on coming into the title at 23, neither understood nor possessed the patience to overhaul. The walls were panelled in oak, gone dark with 2 centuries of beeswax. The carpet was a faded crimson aubusson, worn very smooth in 2 paths, one between the door and his desk, and one between his desk and the south window, where, in winter, the only afternoon light the room received fell across his correspondence in a narrow gold band. There was a smell about the room of paper, ink, the faint, dry leather of the chair seats, and the cold, blackened brick of an unlit fire. And the Duke, when he found himself unable to think clearly elsewhere, came to this room because it was the only room in the house that had been organized by somebody who had loved him. The Morning Post was set on a silver tray on the corner of the desk, sorted into 3 piles by his secretary, Phelps. Personal, estate, political. The Wexford card sat at the top of the personal pile. It had been delivered, Phelps noted in the margin of the daybook, by hand at 6 in the morning, by a footman in Wexford livery, with the request that it be placed on the Duke's desk before the political pile was opened. Aldermere read the card. He did not, his secretary observed, react to it. He did not react to it because he had spent the previous 24 hours doing 2 things at once. The first was sitting in stillness in a chair facing his unlit fire, replaying, minute by minute, inflection by inflection, every single conversation he had ever had with Eleanor Marlowe. The second was going through his own correspondence drawer, removing every single anonymous note, every single piece of unsigned political intelligence, every single folded paper of 3 months' standing that had arrived without provenance, and laying them out in chronological order on his desk. He had thought, when he began, that there would be perhaps 3 or 4. There were 11. 11 anonymous notes, in 11 slightly different hands, not, on closer inspection, 11 hands. One hand, deliberately disguised 11 different ways. 11 pieces of intelligence about Whitford's allies, the Tenant Relief Bill's quiet supporters, the Bishop's unspoken willingness to come down to Hampshire and witness the signing of 3 deeds in a single afternoon. 11 pieces of political assistance for which he had thanked no one, because he had no one to thank. He stared at them for a long time. Then he rang for his secretary, said quietly, "Have my carriage at the door in an hour. I'm going to Grosvenor Square," and went upstairs to change. He did not go to Grosvenor Square that morning. He sat in his carriage at the corner of Brook Street for 40 minutes. He thought about what he was going to say. He discarded what he was going to say. He thought about something else. He discarded that. He considered, briefly, a speech. He discarded the speech with revulsion. Then he leaned out and told his coachman to take him home. He did not write to her either. He sat that evening in his library with the unlit fire and the carriage clock and the smell of cold brick and old leather, and he turned the situation over in his mind, as one turns over a chess problem composed by a player far better than oneself. The problem was not the political problem. He had understood the political problem within 10 minutes of laying out the 11 anonymous notes. The political problem was, in fact, already largely solved on his behalf. The problem that kept him in his chair until the carriage clock chimed 2 was the personal problem, which was that he had, in front of 9 witnesses and a pug, allowed a man he despised to humiliate the woman he had been falling in love with for 3 weeks, and he had been 3 seconds slower to rise than she had been to absorb the blow and walk out under her own command. 3 seconds. He kept returning to the 3 seconds. They were the difference between a man who deserved her and a man who did not. They were the difference between a partner she could trust and a partner she could not. They were the difference, he understood at last, between the man he had thought himself to be at 3:30 in the morning over a chessboard and the man he had actually been at 9:30 in the evening with a glass of port in his hand and a sneer in the air. He went to bed at 3. He did not sleep. He rose at 5, dressed, and walked the length of Brook Street and back twice in the cold pearl light of an early May London dawn. And he understood by the time he came into a hot bath at 7 that there was no apology that could be written down. There was only the question of whether one continued to be 3 seconds too slow for the rest of one's life, or one stopped. He did, however, take her invitation card off his desk and put it in the inside breast pocket of the coat he meant to wear on Friday. It stayed there for 36 hours. The Wexford Ball, which was not, by its card, a ball, opened at 9 in the evening on Friday, with 240 of the most curious people in London streaming up the marble staircase of the house in Grosvenor Square. The drawing rooms had been opened. The gallery doors had been opened. The portrait of Lady Eleanor Wexford at 19, 3 months before her grandmother's funeral, hung in its proper place at the head of the long gallery. Lady Eleanor Wexford herself stood beneath her own portrait at the foot of the gallery, in a gown of dark ruby silk that her aunt had personally sent up from Hampshire that morning, with a single ruby on a thin gold chain at her throat and her mother's signet ring on her left thumb. Her hair was up. She had let her own maid put it up, instead of the elaborate London arrangement her father's housekeeper had wished, and the effect, simple, dark, glossy, would have looked plain on another woman, and looked, on Eleanor, like a deliberate refusal of ornament. Her father stood beside her. People came. People bowed. People made polite, slightly stunned conversation about the country, about Hampshire, about the recent excellent weather, about anything and everything that was not the question that was actually in the room, which was, where had she been, this Marquis's daughter, for 16 weeks? And was it true she had broken her own engagement? And was it true that the man she had broken it from had subsequently been refused entry to 3 of the better houses in town? Whitford did not come. He had, an hour before, sent a curt note pleading a sudden illness. The card, Eleanor noticed, had been read aloud by Hardwick, the butler, with a flatness that suggested Hardwick had had something to do with the precise arrangement that had made the illness necessary. Aldermere did not come either. By 10:30 he had not come. By 11 o'clock he had not come. Eleanor smiled. She danced. She laughed at something her cousin said about the curate. She did not look at the door. At 17 minutes past 11, the music dropped in volume. Only an instant, the kind of instant a trained orchestra produces when a note is being added to the room. And her father, beside her, said quietly, "Eleanor." She turned. Aldermere was at the head of the gallery. He had come, she saw at once, alone. He had not brought a single member of his entourage. He was in formal black, with no ornament except his father's hawk-crested signet, and he looked, even from this distance, like a man who had spent the past 48 hours arguing with himself and had lost. He did not, she observed, look at the room. He looked at the portrait. He stood beneath the portrait of Lady Eleanor Wexford at 19 for a long time. He looked at it as a man looks at a piece of evidence whose significance he had not previously been allowed to interpret. Then he turned his head, slowly, and looked at her. He crossed the room. He did not move quickly. He moved at the pace that did not suggest urgency, because urgency would have been a discourtesy to her, and he knew it. The gallery, which had been filled with conversation, was no longer filled with conversation. 240 of the most curious people in London had collectively realized that something interesting was about to happen at the foot of the gallery, and they had collectively decided to allow it to happen. He stopped 3 feet from her. He bowed. "Lady Eleanor," he said. It was the first time she had ever heard him say her name. "Your Grace." "I have come," he said, "to ask whether you would do me the honor of dancing with me, if I am not too late to ask." "You are not too late." He held out his hand. She put hers in it. The orchestra at the head of the gallery was a small one. 6 players, hired for the night from the household of a friend of her father's, set up on the small dais beneath the long bank of candles where the gallery ceiling rose into its pale blue and cream coffer. They had been playing, when Aldemir entered, the second of the long Vienna waltzes that had become, this season, the music a London hostess put on when she wished to indicate that her party was both fashionable and, at the same time, perfectly serious. The first violin, who had been taking his cues from the conductor and not from the room, looked across at the conductor in mild confusion when, at the end of the figure, the conductor lifted one finger, paused the orchestra for the briefest of breaths, and motioned the strings to begin again at the longest of the introductory passages, the one that allowed 2 new dancers a full 40 seconds of slow, gliding entrance before the rhythm tightened into the dance proper. Eleanor, who had been raised in this house and who had been counting bars at her father's parties since she was 9, felt the courtesy as it was being given, and inclined her head a 1/4 of an inch in the direction of the dais. The conductor, a small, grey-haired German who had once played at her grandmother's golden wedding, inclined his head a 1/4 of an inch in return. They danced. The orchestra, sensibly, played the longest waltz they knew. He did not speak for the first bar. She did not speak for the second. "I thought you would not come," she said, at the third. "I almost did not. I came twice yesterday and turned back." "Why?" "Because I had not yet worked out what I would say." "And have you worked it out?" "No, but I have stopped trying." "That is a wise decision. I do not require a speech." "I have not prepared one. I have, however, brought you something." He stopped them in the middle of the floor, courteously, as if the music were merely background to a transaction more important than music, and reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat. He took out a small object wrapped in white silk. He placed it in her hand. It was the White Queen. "I kept her," he said, low. "I told myself it was because we had not yet finished the game. It was not. It was because I had taken her from the board the night I met you, and I did not, even then, want to give her back." She closed her hand around the Queen. "You may finish the game," she said. "On Wednesday next, in the small library here, at 3 in the afternoon. I shall have the board ready." 3 in the afternoon. "I no longer play at 3 in the morning. I've been 3 weeks at home and have grown civilized." "I do not believe you have." "Then you will be the first, Your Grace, to find out." The music came back into the room. They danced. He danced, she discovered, like a man who had been taught at 12 and had been required to do it 3 or 4 times a year ever since, against his will, with patient competence and no flair. She liked him better for it. They did not speak again for the rest of the dance. When the music ended, he bowed over her hand. He said, "Wednesday." "Wednesday." He turned, as a man should turn, and made his way back across the gallery. And as he reached the threshold of the room, he stopped, briefly, deliberately, beneath the portrait of her at 19, and he inclined his head to it, not to the room, to the painting. As one acknowledges, formally, an entity to whom one has been very recently introduced, and from whom one has obtained a courtesy one did not deserve. Then he was gone. Eleanor, who had not wept since the night her engagement had broken 16 weeks earlier, did not weep then either. She did, however, allow herself to lean, for 1/2 second only, against her father's arm, and her father, who knew his daughter, did not say anything, and did not move, and did not look at her, and did not betray by the slightest movement of any muscle that he had felt her lean. Then she went on dancing. Wednesday came. He was punctual to the minute. The footman showed him into the small library, a south-facing room with 2 windows onto the rose garden, 2 leather chairs, and 1 chessboard set up on a table between them. The white pieces were on his side, the black were on hers. She was already in the room. She had risen at her usual hour, 6:30, the hour her grandmother had risen at. She had spent the morning in the great library at Wexford House, drafting a long letter to her father's secretary about the autumn parliamentary session, and she had taken her luncheon at the small writing table in the morning room, with a plate of cold chicken and 1 peach from the hothouse beside her papers. By the time the carriages began to be heard in the square at 2:30, she had bathed, changed into a soft slate-grey gown, of the sort her mother had used to wear when she meant to give a serious afternoon to a serious purpose, dressed her own hair simply, and walked down to the small library 20 minutes early. She had set the board out herself. She had set a small carafe of water and 2 glasses on the side table. She had drawn the curtains back fully on all 4 windows, because she wanted, when this conversation took place, to have light. Then she had taken her seat opposite the door, black side, since it had been hers all along, and she had sat very still in the gold quiet of the south windows, and waited. "You have given me white," he said. "You preferred black last time. I am giving you the chance to be bored by white again." He sat down opposite her. He looked at the board. He did not, immediately, touch a piece. "Lady Eleanor." "Yes?" "Before we play, there is something I would like to say. It is not a speech. It is 2 sentences." "Then say them." The leather of the chair beneath her was warm where her wool skirt pressed against it. The smooth, dark wood of the chess table was cool beneath her fingertips. Outside the south window, a thrush in the wet hedge stopped its quiet conversation, considered the silence in the small library, and began again. The smell of beeswax from the freshly polished mantel and the dry, sharp smell of newsprint from the morning paper folded on the side table met in the air between them. He looked at her steadily. The small white scar through his eyebrow caught the spring light from the south window. "I should have stood up the moment Whitford spoke," he said, "and I did not. The reason I did not is that I was 3 seconds slower than you, and you removed the necessity from me. I will not be 3 seconds slower again." She inclined her head. The afternoon light moved 1 slow, pale finger along the polished wood of the chess table. She felt the warm, dry brush of it across the back of her hand, and the cold, smooth weight of the silver pen tray at her elbow. "That is 1 sentence. The second is shorter. I have been 3 months becoming, by accident, the kind of man who deserved to receive the help you were giving me anonymously. I would now like the rest of my life to be spent becoming, deliberately, the kind of man who deserves to receive it, openly." She was silent for a long time. "Your Grace," she said at last, "you do understand that the second sentence was very nearly a speech?" "I do." "And you swore there would not be a speech?" "I did." "You will be required, throughout the duration of this acquaintance, to forfeit 1 chess piece per speech. You may select which piece in advance." "My queen." "Your queen?" "It is the piece I value most. Therefore the forfeit will be felt." "The forfeit is felt, as written." The small library was at this hour the warmest room in the house. 3 windows along the south wall threw 3 slanted bars of late spring sun across the polished cherry wood floor. The 4th window, smaller and west-facing, threw a 4th bar at a different angle, so that the carpet between the 2 leather chairs was crossed by a faint asymmetric grid of light that shifted, every few minutes, as a slow procession of high white clouds passed overhead. The chessboard sat in the center of that grid. The pieces were the old Wexford set, a plain cream and a dark walnut. The tallest pieces are hand-high, with the small, flat, circular bases that did not tip easily on a table that had been brushed by a careless skirt. Hardwick had set them out himself an hour before. Hardwick had also, Eleanor noticed, left 2 crystal glasses of clear water on the corner table behind her, and a small silver tray of plain biscuits, and 1 folded white linen napkin, in the manner of a man who had not asked what was about to take place, but who had a reasonably accurate suspicion, and intended to be prepared. She moved a pawn. He answered. They played. They played for an hour and a half, by which time her queen had taken 4 pieces, and his had taken 6, and the position had reached the kind of careful symmetry that only happens between 2 players of nearly equal force, which, Aldemir had begun privately to recognize, they were, given the same hours of practice. She was the better tactician. He was the better closer. The combination was extraordinary. He had never had a partner across a board who saw the game the way he saw it. He was beginning to suspect he had never had a partner across anything who did. He moved a knight. She did not move at once. She studied his move for a long time, and then she looked up at him, and she said quietly, "Maximilian." It was the first time she had used his name. "Yes. My terms. Yes. I will marry you. I will marry you because I love you. I have loved you since the morning you would not look at me at breakfast and pretended we had not met. Because that was the first time I understood that you were a man capable of treating with a stranger in the dark and a stranger in the light as if they were the same person. I do, however, have terms. State them. My father's political work continues through me. I will not retire from it. I will not become an ornament in your house. I will draft, I will correspond, I will arrange. I will do it openly, and it will be known that I am doing it. If your peers find this irregular, you will defend me. If they find it scandalous, you will defend me. If they find it attractive, which they will not, you will be mildly amused, but you will still defend me. Yes. She paused. She had been speaking, she realized, for some time without inflection, the way she had heard her father speak, from the head of a long dining table to a row of attentive politicians. She softened her voice deliberately. Second, when the tenant relief bill passes, which it will on the Wexford block in the 2nd week of June, you will not, in your speech of thanks, refer to my work. The work was my father's, formerly, and will be received as my father's. I do not require the public credit. I do, in private and in our own household, require the truth. Yes. The clock on the small library mantel ticked through 12 seconds. A bee blundered against the south window glass, considered the situation, and returned to its previous flight path. Eleanor watched its bumbling correction, the way she had once, on a spring morning at her aunt's, watched a different bee work its way along an upper sash. The world was full of small, slow, stupid living things, finding their way out of rooms they had not meant to enter. Aldemir, opposite her, did not move. Third, Whitford. You will not duel him. You will not cut him publicly. You will, instead, allow him to fade into the background of his own irrelevance, where he belongs. And you will give me, privately, behind closed doors of this household, and never in public, the satisfaction of having made him irrelevant by means he cannot complain about without confessing that he was once relevant. Do you understand the distinction? I do. Fourth, we will be married in Hampshire, from my aunt's house. Lady Pembury is to be permitted to organize it on whatever scale she selects. Galahad is to attend. Galahad will attend. Fifth, and this is the last. You will not, on any occasion ever again in our shared life, tell anyone, including me, including yourself, and including any future child of ours, that anyone has, in any context, exceeded their place. He looked at her steadily. I accept your terms. He did not look at the board. He did not, for a long, unhurried moment, look anywhere except at her face. The bar of sun that had earlier crossed the carpet had moved by perhaps 3 inches over the course of the terms. It now lay across the small mahogany table at her elbow, and lit, very precisely, the edge of the white queen on its windowsill spot above the desk in the corner of the room. The queen Eleanor had taken from Pembury and brought to London and placed in this room, because she had wanted, when this conversation finally happened, the queen to be in the room. The light caught the small chip on the queen's crown. The chip, which had once been the kind of detail Eleanor noticed only because she was holding the piece, was today, by some quiet trick of her attention, the most visible thing in the room. Outside the south window, a sparrow attempted to settle on the wisteria, and was persuaded otherwise by a small breeze. The clock on the mantel went on with its careful interior conversation. Somewhere along the corridor, very far off, a door closed, and then was followed by the muted footsteps of a footman crossing the marble of the entry hall on his way to the back of the house. Eleanor was aware, with the cataloguing precision she had been trained for, of every one of these small noises, and she was aware, simultaneously, that Aldermere had not, in fact, moved. "Then move," she said, "and finish the game." He looked at the board. He moved his king. He did not, she noted, move his queen. "That is not a winning move." "No, it is mine." She looked at him for a long, slow moment. Then she leaned forward across the chessboard and, very deliberately, knocked her own king onto its side. "You have won," she said. "I have not." "You have. I resign in your favor. That is not how the game is played." "It is," she said, "how this game is played. The game began 3 weeks ago, with you abandoning white because it bored you. It ends today with me resigning to a king who refuses to move his queen because he understands that if he loses his queen, the game is over, and the game must not be over. There is, Your Grace, a longer game now." He stood up. He came around the table. He took her hand, gently, formally, the way a man requests permission from a woman, not the way a man takes possession of a woman. And he raised it to his mouth, and he kissed it. Then he kissed her. It was not the kiss he had imagined. He had imagined, in the carriage on the way over, a kiss of solemn dignity, the kiss of a man rendering homage to a woman whose superior social standing he had now formally acknowledged. The kiss that actually happened was nothing of the kind. It was warm. It was uncomplicated. It was answered. And when he stopped, because he was, after all, still in the small library of the Wexford townhouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were footmen, she was smiling. He had not, until that moment, ever seen her properly smile. "Maximilian," she said. "Eleanor, you may sit down. We are not finished. There is more. There is the question of our wedding present to one another. I have given mine considerable thought. And you will be required, on the day of our marriage, to teach Charlie how to play chess. Charlie, your gardener's boy, the apple boy. He has, I am informed by your steward, who corresponds with my father's steward, demonstrated a precocious interest in your chess set since you returned from London. He has been seen, twice, attempting to move the white queen by herself across the board. He believes she is dancing. You will teach him. I will teach him. You will teach him patiently. You will teach him as my grandmother taught me. You will teach him as a person who is loved is taught. I will. And you will, she said softly, permit him, when he is ready, which I am told will be in approximately 6 years, given his current rate of progress with apple varieties, to defeat you, fairly, for the first time, on a Wednesday afternoon in the South Orchard. And you will tell him then that he has played excellently. And you will say it because it is true. Eleanor. Yes? How long have you been thinking about this? Since the first letter I had from you, the one in which you mentioned the apples. I have been thinking, since then, about the kind of life that would deserve a small boy bringing apples on Wednesdays without invitation. I have thought about it a great deal. He looked at her. That, he said, is what I love about you. It was the first time he had used the word. She did not, this time, look down. She did not look away. She did not, as she had once allowed herself to do in her aunt's morning room, allow herself to feel anything in the cold pit at the bottom of her ribs. Because there was no longer a cold pit at the bottom of her ribs. There was only spring light coming through the south window, and a chessboard between them with a king on its side, and a man across the table who had told her the truth in 2 sentences and a kiss. "Maximilian," she said. Yes. The small library was very quiet. The bee at the south window had given up at last and gone, but the sweet, faint warmth of the rose garden air still moved through the room and stirred the loose curl at her temple. The smooth ivory of the white queen on the windowsill behind her glowed bright in the slanting 4 o'clock light. She felt the warm, steady pulse at her own wrist as it pressed against the dark wood of the chair arm. I love you also. I had hoped. You had earned. That, he said, is the better word. The tenant relief bill passed in the 2nd week of June, very nearly unanimously, on the Wexford block, and a quiet last-minute defection of 2 members of the Northern block, who had, it transpired, also been receiving anonymous correspondence of unusual quality and accuracy, and had, finally, decided that they preferred to be on its side. The night the bill passed, Eleanor was at her writing table at Wexford House. She heard the news the way she heard most political news, through a back door of the household, by a footman bringing her a folded note from her father's secretary on a small silver salver at 11:15 at night. The note said only, "Carried, 218 to 34. Whitford absent. M is rising to thank." She read it twice. She set it on the desk beside the White Queen, who occupied her usual spot on the windowsill above the desk, among a small standing army of Eleanor's pens, 3 blotters, and a single dried sprig of hawthorn she'd carried back from Pembury in her travelling case, and had never quite known what to do with. She did not move for several minutes. She listened to the house, the soft, slow tick of the long case clock in the front hall, the distant murmur of her father's voice in the library below, the quiet rumble of an empty hackney passing in the square. And she let the news settle. Then she rose, went down the servants' stairs in her stockinged feet, opened the back door of Wexford House onto the small mews garden behind it, and stood for one long moment in the cool night air, looking at the pale sliver of June moon above the chimneys. She did not cry. She had not, in fact, cried at any point this season, but she stood in the mews garden with the moon on her face and the new green smell of the kitchen herbs around her ankles, and she allowed herself to feel, the way an honest accountant allows herself to feel a balanced book, the simple, uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing carefully done. Then she went back upstairs and finished the letter she had been writing to her aunt about the wedding flowers. Aldermere's speech of thanks was, as agreed, formal, restrained, and credited the Marquess of Wexford for his statesmanship and his block for its courage. The Marquess of Wexford, sitting across the chamber, accepted the credit with grave dignity, and 3 nights later, at Aldermere House, over a small private supper for 4, raised his glass to his daughter and said, "Eleanor, to the work." "To the work, father." "To the work," said Aldermere. "To the work," said Lady Pembury, who had come up to town for the occasion, and who, having taken a glass of port slightly larger than she had been advised to, added, "and to the truly excellent embarrassment of Lord Whitford, who has retired to Bath for his health and is, my sources tell me, not coming back. Aunt, Eleanor, dear, one must occasionally toast a thoroughly satisfactory conclusion." "To the satisfactory conclusion," said the Marquess of Wexford, gravely, and the 4 of them drank. They were married in Hampshire, on a green afternoon at the end of June, from her aunt's house, by the curate from Pembury Parish, who had, since the night in the chess room, lost his fear of Whitford, and discovered in the process that he had quite a good speaking voice when he was not being intimidated. In front of a congregation of approximately 90 guests, 3 tenant families from the Southern Moor, 4 staff from the Wexford townhouse, and 1 pug, Galahad, who slept through the ceremony from a velvet cushion in the front pew, and who, on being woken to depart, expressed his approval of the proceedings by licking the bride's hand. The little parish church at Pembury was a building of the 12th century, of pale local stone, set back from the road in an oak-shaded churchyard, whose grass had been scythed flat that morning by 2 of the gardeners. The smell of cut grass hung over the lich gate. Inside, the church smelled of oiled oak, beeswax candles already lit at the altar at noon, and great trailing armfuls of cream cabbage roses and sweet peas that Lady Pembury had personally driven her gardeners to assemble in coppered urns on every available surface. Through the south clerestory, the late June light came down in 3 angled bars and lay across the stone floor of the nave in pale gold rectangles that shifted, very slowly, as the afternoon went on. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm in a gown of cream silk faced in indigo, with her grandmother's pearls at her throat, a single rope, no diamonds, and her mother's signet ring still on her left thumb because she had refused to take it off for any wedding, including her own. The Marquis of Wexford, whom most members of the congregation had never seen smile, smiled 4 times during the half-hour ceremony, twice openly, and the curate, who had practiced the address for a fortnight in front of his looking-glass, got it through cleanly without a single stumble. Aldermere, when his wife was placed beside him at the altar rail, did not look at her at first. He looked instead at her hand on the rail, then at her face, then at her hand again. Then, finally, in the small silence between the curate's sentences, he looked at her properly. He did not smile. He did not need to. The expression on his face was the expression of a man on whom a long argument had at last fallen silent. Charmy, who at 6 was old enough to be entrusted with a serious assignment, and not yet old enough to be self-conscious about it, carried the rings on a small green velvet cushion, and did not, at any point, drop them. He had been promised, in the event of absolute success, an apple of his own choosing from the southern orchard. He was, according to his father, planning the choice for some weeks. They went home to Aldermere afterwards. It was late summer by the time the household had settled into its new rhythm. Eleanor's correspondence had been moved into the great library, the one with the south windows and the long oak table, and her father's secretary had been seconded to the household for the autumn parliamentary session. 2 new maps of the Southern Moor hung on the south wall. 3 deed boxes, securely locked, sat on the lower shelf. The White Queen from the chess set in the small library at Pembury, which Eleanor had taken with her in her travelling case and had refused to leave behind, sat on the windowsill above her writing desk, where the late afternoon light caught her every day at 5:30. It was on a Wednesday afternoon at 5:30 at the end of August that Maximilian Hawke, Duke of Aldermere, returning from the south orchard with a basket of apples that had been pressed upon him by Charlie, who had grown over the summer and now came up to his thigh, and who had this afternoon delivered 3 pippins and an Ashmead's kernel personally for the Duchess, paused at the open door of the great library and watched his wife. She was sitting on the floor. She was sitting on the floor of the great library with Charlie cross-legged opposite her, the chessboard between them, and the White Queen in Charlie's small, grubby hand. "She does not move that way," Eleanor was saying, gravely. "She wants to. She may want to. She is, however, governed by certain rules." "Why?" "Because all queens are." "Even you?" "Even me. Galahad is not governed by rules. Galahad is a pug. The rules are different for pugs. Now move her properly." Charlie, who had brown curls and freckles and his father's serious, considering face, considered the board. Then, with great care, he moved the White Queen 6 squares forward in a perfectly straight line and put her down beside the Black King with the firmness of a small judge passing sentence. Like that. Exactly like that. Have I won? You have. Did I win because she danced? No, you won because you saw the line. It is the better reason. Remember it. Aldemir did not move from the doorway. He stood, he had been standing, he realized, for some minutes, and watched his wife, in a high-waisted gown of soft summer indigo, with her hair down for the heat, teach a 6-year-old to think 6 squares forward. The small white queen sat between them on the polished oak floor. The light through the south window was the same color as the hawthorn blossom afternoon outside Pembury, and the same color, almost exactly, as the candle that had burned itself out in the chess room of Pembury Hall on a night in late April, when a woman in a wrapper had walked barefoot down a corridor and chosen a chair her aunt had told her not to take. He stood in the doorway with a basket of apples and watched her. After a long moment, without looking up, she said, "Maximilian." "Yes?" "You have been standing in that doorway for 4 minutes." "I have." "Charlie has noticed. Charlie thinks you are inspecting his form." "I am admiring his form." "Have you brought the apples?" "I have." "Then come in. You are no longer in the wrong place. You have not been in the wrong place for some time." He came in. He set the basket down on the long oak table. He crossed the polished floor of the great library, because his wife and a 6-year-old were sitting on it, and it would have been graceless to ask them to rise. He sat down on the floor opposite Charlie. Charlie, with the air of a man including a junior partner in an important enterprise, slid the chessboard sideways to make room. "You may take the black side, Your Grace," Charlie said, in his small, serious voice. "The white side is the better one. I am keeping it." "Of course you are." "You may have the king." "Thank you. Do not move him too much. He is older than the other pieces and tires easily." Eleanor, on the polished oak floor of the great library at Aldemir, in late August, in the warm sideways light of 5:30, made a sound that her husband had heard precisely once before in his life, in the cold dark of a Hampshire chess room in late April, just after she had told him that she had imagined him taller. And he turned his head, in the way of a man who's been waiting since April to hear the same sound a second time, and watched his wife laugh. Charlie placed the white queen carefully in the center of the board. "Begin," he said. They began. Outside, the late summer light went through the open south windows of the great library at Aldemir and lay across the floor in long, warm bars, and on the windowsill above the writing desk, the original white queen, the one that had been carried in a wrapper pocket from Pembury Hall to London, and from London to Hampshire, and from Hampshire to here, sat in her usual place, watching, as she had watched all summer, the slow, unhurried becoming of a household that had, by careful attention and the patient turning of small, honest pieces, finally arrived at the right square on the right board. If you have ever known the particular satisfaction of having been underestimated by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, and of being patient enough to let them find out, slowly, completely, and on your terms, then this story has been for you. Pull the chair a little closer to the fire. There will be more by next Wednesday. I shall be here.